The bullet enters at 4:07 p.m. President William McKinley feels it before he hears it. It is a violent punch to his abdomen, followed instantly by another. The crushing impact drives all the air from his lungs. He is standing inside the Temple of Music at Buffalo's Grand Pan American Exposition. He is smiling and shaking hands with hundreds of everyday citizens who have waited in line for hours under the autumn sun just to meet him. The heavy organ music echoing through the vaulted ceiling does not stop immediately. For a confusing, frozen moment, no one in the crowded room understands what has just occurred. Then, the president staggers backward. Dark blood spreads rapidly across his white silk vest like a blooming rose. As you listen tonight, let the decades pass softly. Let the long, rhythmic story of this forgotten shore carry your mind into a deep and peaceful rest. Before we step into the depths of this history, please take a quick moment to leave a like, subscribe, and share in the comments where and at what hour you are listening from tonight. Seeing your footsteps gather here brings endless joy to this archive. Now, let the outside world fade into total silence. Breathe deeply and let our journey begin. In the surging crowd, a quiet man with a white cotton handkerchief wrapped tightly around his right hand is tackled viciously to the floorboards. Leon Czolgosz, 28 years old, unemployed, an avowed anarchist, offers no resistance. He does not struggle against the iron grip of the law, nor does he attempt to run, as Secret Service agents and armed soldiers pile heavily on top of him, and as the enraged crowd surges forward ready to tear him limb from limb, Czolgosz remains eerily calm. He has accomplished what he travelled across the country to do. McKinley, clutching his bleeding stomach as his guards carry him toward an electric ambulance, whispers words that will echo through the halls of history. Do not let them hurt him. Then, thinking of his fragile, invalid wife, he murmurs softly, "Be careful how you tell her." Outside the Temple of Music, the Pan American Exposition blazes with dazzling electric light. 2 million incandescent bulbs illuminated grand palaces, painted in brilliant, rainbow colors. These lights were powered directly by the roaring currents of Niagara Falls. This was meant to be Buffalo's defining moment on the global stage. It was the city's triumphant debut as one of America's greatest metropolises. At the turn of the 20th century, Buffalo was the 8th largest city in the entire United States. It boasted more millionaires per capita than New York City or Chicago. Delaware Avenue was lined with limestone mansions that rivaled the royal palaces of Europe. Massive steel mills forged the structural girders of American industrial expansion. Giant grain elevators along the river fed the entire nation. Brilliant electric light announced the dawn of a glorious new century. And now, there was blood on the polished floor of the Temple of Music. What follows is a dark, historical tragedy in 3 distinct acts. The first act unfolds over 8 agonizing days, as a team of prominent doctors bungles the president's medical care with staggering incompetence. A gynecological surgeon operates under dim twilight. He closes internal gastric wounds with ordinary black silk thread meant for mending clothes. He stubbornly refuses to utilize the newly invented X-ray machine that Thomas Edison personally rushed to the city. The second act lasts 13 perilous hours. It is a constitutional void during which the United States has no functioning chief executive. Meanwhile, Vice President Theodore Roosevelt races through absolute mountain darkness by horse and wagon to reach Buffalo before the dawn. The third act takes 50 painful years to complete. Buffalo touched ultimate historical greatness at the precise moment a chief executive died within its borders. Shortly after, it began a long, inexorable slide into economic ruin. By 1950, Buffalo remained America's 15th largest city. Its population crested at 580,000 residents. But by 2010, more than half of those people were gone forever. The giant steel mills stood hollow and empty against the cold lake winds. The soaring grain elevators along the river fell completely silent. Ocean-going cargo ships bypassed the city entirely. They traveled through the newly opened St. Lawrence Seaway as if Buffalo had never existed on the map. The palatial mansions of Delaware Avenue were systematically demolished. converted into cheap boarding houses, or donated to local charities for pennies on the dollar. Entire residential neighborhoods emptied out like water draining from a broken bathtub. This is the story of how a majestic city rose to meet presidents and fell into total obscurity. This is the story of how blood spilled on September 6, 1901, stained far more than marble floorboards. This is the tragic narrative of America's forgotten Gilded Age capital. To understand how Buffalo reached this staggering height before its precipitous fall, one must look at the physical layout of the Pan American Exposition itself. Spanning 350 acres, the grounds were designed to project absolute dominance over the natural world. The fairgrounds were organized around a majestic central court, flanked by enormous exhibition buildings. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building covered thousands of square feet. The Temple of Music sat prominently at the intersection of several major avenues. It was an architectural marvel constructed of timber, plaster, and decorative staffwork painted in rich yellow ochre and gold trim. Its central dome rose 136 feet into the air. Inside, an immense pipe organ built by the Emmons Howard Company filled the auditorium with rich, thunderous acoustics. On that warm September afternoon, over 2,000 people packed into the Temple of Music for the public reception. The atmosphere was celebratory. The exposition had already brought over 2 million visitors to Buffalo since opening its gates in May. Citizens stood patiently in a long, winding line that stretched far out into the esplanade. They shuffled forward under the watchful eyes of municipal police officers, exposition guards, and Secret Service personnel. President McKinley stood near the center of the auditorium, flanked by John G. Milburn, the president of the exposition, and George B. Cortelyou, his private secretary. McKinley was at the absolute peak of his political popularity. He had recently secured a decisive re-election victory alongside his energetic young vice president, Theodore Roosevelt. The nation was enjoying unprecedented economic prosperity following the dark years of the 1893 financial panic. McKinley wore his customary long black frock coat, starched white shirt, white vest, and dark trousers. He greeted every person with a warm smile, a firm handshake, and his signature brief bow. The crowd moved quickly, averaging nearly 50 handshakes per minute. The organist, William J. Gompf, was playing Bach's Sonata in F to drown out the shuffling noise of thousands of feet. Yet, beneath this festive exterior, security was dangerously lax by modern standards. The concept of presidential security in 1901 was still in its infancy. Secret Service agents stood near the president, but they were trained primarily to spot known counterfeiters and financial fraudsters rather than political assassins. Leon Czolgosz stepped into the Temple of Music carrying a deadly secret. He had purchased the .32 caliber Iver Johnson revolver several days earlier at a hardware store in downtown Buffalo for $4.50. He had spent the morning walking through the fairgrounds, blending seamlessly with the crowd. As he approached the president in the receiving line, he stepped behind a large man who engaged McKinley in a brief conversation. Czolgosz held his right hand up to his chest, carefully wrapped in a thick white cotton handkerchief to conceal the weapon. To the guards, it appeared to be an ordinary bandage covering an injury. No one questioned him. No one asked him to raise his hands. When McKinley reached out his hand to greet the young man, Czolgosz stepped forward, brushed the president's hand aside, and fired 2 shots at point-blank range through the cotton cloth. The muffled cracks sounded like small firecrackers going off indoors. The flash of gunpowder scorched McKinley's coat. The first bullet struck the president on the sternum, deflecting off bone and inflicting only a superficial flesh wound. The second bullet struck him full in the stomach, penetrating the anterior and posterior walls before embedding itself deep in the muscular tissue of his back. McKinley stood motionless for a second, a look of profound disbelief sweeping across his face. Then his knees buckled, and he collapsed into the arms of his horrified aides. Before the violent gunshots echoed inside the Temple of Music, before the dark wooden tenements and the industrial pollution, there was only water. The vast inland sea of Lake Erie terminated at Buffalo's natural harbor, and from there, the waters found their natural path toward the Atlantic Ocean. This unique geographic placement was the city's original blessing and its ultimate economic curse. It was a natural location that transformed Buffalo into one of the most vital industrial hubs in North America and ultimately sealed its long-term fate. When the Erie Canal officially opened in 1825, Buffalo transformed overnight. It grew from a sleepy frontier village at the edge of the wilderness into the primary gateway between the agricultural Great Lakes and the wealthy eastern seaboard. Golden wheat from the vast prairies of the Midwest poured through Buffalo's harbor. Timber from the northern forests traveled its artificial waterways. By the middle of the 19th century, Buffalo had become the largest grain port on Earth. Its massive wooden and brick grain elevators rose along the waterfront like towering cathedrals to modern human commerce. The coming of heavy steam railroads truly ignited Buffalo's ascent into the absolute pantheon of American industrial cities. By 1900, Buffalo was the second largest railroad hub in the entire United States, surpassed only by Chicago. Dozens of major rail lines converged directly on the city from every direction. The piercing screech of heavy steel wheels against iron tracks and the thunder of massive steam locomotives formed the constant, rhythmic symphony of human progress. Raw materials flowed in continuously from the outer edges of the continent. High-grade iron ore from Minnesota's rich Mesabi Range was shipped across Lake Erie. Heavy anthracite coal arrived via rail lines from the mines of Pennsylvania. Finished industrial goods then flowed out rapidly to supply the booming markets of the eastern seaboard. Then came the ultimate industrial miracle: electricity. Just 20 miles north of downtown Buffalo, the mighty Niagara River plunged over a massive limestone precipice. In that eternal, deafening thunder, visionary industrialists saw not merely sublime natural beauty, but raw, untamed mechanical power waiting desperately to be harnessed. The engineering challenges standing in their way were immense and unprecedented. How could human ingenuity capture the kinetic force of millions of gallons of water plunging 200 feet every second? How could engineers convert that colossal kinetic energy into usable electrical currents and transmit it successfully across vast distances without losing its force? The answer finally emerged through a series of revolutionary technical innovations during the 1890s that completely transformed global power generation. In 1895, the Niagara Falls Power Company delivered high-voltage electricity for the very first time to local commercial customers. The grand, Romanesque stone structures of the Adams Power Station housed massive, turbine-driven, alternating current dynamos operating under a waterhead more than twice as great as anything ever attempted before in human history. With electrical generators 5 times larger than any previously constructed, the specialized transformers required were completely unprecedented in scale. By 1896, electricity was successfully transmitted 20 miles from Niagara Falls directly to downtown Buffalo. This marked the first successful long-distance transmission of commercial electrical power anywhere in the world. A distance of 20 miles seemed nothing short of miraculous to contemporaries at the time. Buffalo instantly became known across the globe as the City of Light. Its public streets were brilliantly illuminated by electricity, at a time when most other major American municipalities still relied on dim, flickering gas lamps. Its roaring factories hummed efficiently with the clean power of falling water, and the cost of electrical energy in Buffalo became the absolute cheapest in the entire nation. Industries requiring massive, continuous electrical power flocked to the region in search of competitive advantage. Among the most significant corporate relocations was the Lackawanna Iron and Steel Company. Executives decided to relocate their entire multi-million-dollar operation from Pennsylvania to an expansive site just south of Buffalo along the shores of Lake Erie. The critical decision was made with breathtaking speed. On March 23, 1899, Walter Scranton of Lackawanna Steel met directly with prominent Buffalo business leaders, including John J. Albright, president of the Ontario Power Company, and John G. Milburn, to discuss the large-scale purchase of undeveloped lakeshore land. Within days, they had selected a sprawling, empty shoreline area in what was then the western portion of the town of West Seneca. Albright began aggressively purchasing the necessary acreage on April 1st, successfully securing nearly all the required industrial property for the remarkably low price of $1,100,000. By 1900, full-scale construction was underway on what quickly became one of the largest and most productive steel manufacturing complexes in the entire world. At the absolute peak of its industrial capacity, Lackawanna Steel stood as the second largest steel-producing company on Earth, outside of the massive United States Steel Trust. It employed tens of thousands of hard-working men and produced the durable structural steel that literally built America's towering downtown skyscrapers, massive railway bridges, and naval battleships. The geographical location of the plant was practically unbeatable. Iron ore from Minnesota's rich Mesabi Range could be economically shipped by bulk freighters directly across Lake Erie, straight to the Lackawanna docks, while coal from the mines of Pennsylvania arrived efficiently via connecting rail lines. Furthermore, the cheap, abundant hydroelectricity generated at Niagara Falls powered the plant's massive electric furnaces around the clock. Finished steel products were then shipped eastward to major markets like New York and Boston, or westward to supply the rapidly expanding cities of the American Midwest. Despite the explosive growth of steel production, Buffalo proudly maintained its historic crown as the largest grain port in the world at the turn of the 20th century. Towering grain elevators along the active waterfront, massive architectural structures that completely dominated the skyline, processed over 50 million bushels of agricultural grain annually. The Great Northern Grain Elevator, which officially opened in 1897, stood proudly as the largest and most advanced grain storage facility on Earth. Its mechanical milling machinery was among the first in the world to run entirely on electricity, thanks directly to Buffalo's direct transmission link to the Niagara Falls power generation grid. The giant elevator had been expertly designed by a brilliant bridge engineer from the Great Northern Railroad, utilizing an innovative brick box architectural design. The heavy brick exterior performed absolutely no structural load-bearing function. Instead, the entire towering building was held up by an internal structural steel framework that ingeniously supported 48 massive steel storage silos contained within. These revolutionary grain elevators completely saved the aching backs of Irish dock labourers who had previously been forced to shovel and scoop grain by hand, reducing the unloading time of a massive cargo ship from several grueling days down to mere hours. By 1900, Buffalo's resident population surged past 350,000 people, officially establishing it as the 8th largest city in the entire United States. The pace of the city's demographic and physical growth within a single generation had been nothing short of staggering. Ambitious immigrants poured continuously into urban neighborhoods from Ireland, Poland, Italy, Germany, and Eastern Europe, all drawn by the firm promise of steady industrial work, decent wages, and a better life in the mills and factories. Distinct, vibrant neighborhoods quickly sprouted and defined their unique cultural identities across the city landscape. The proud Irish community settled in South Buffalo. The tightly knit Polish enclaves built sprawling neighborhoods on the east side. Italian enclaves grew vibrant near the waterfront, while established German communities thrived throughout the central wards. The city grew remarkably dense, energetic, and alive, its busy streets packed tightly with electric streetcars and endless streams of pedestrians, while its ambient air hung heavy with the thick, unmistakable smell of heavy industry and relentless human ambition. Beneath the roaring mills and shining lights lay the staggering, concentrated wealth of Buffalo's elite. By 1901, Buffalo claimed 60 multimillionaires among its residents. This extraordinary concentration of private wealth gave the city a higher proportion of millionaires per capita than any other major urban center in the Western world. These were rarely men born into inherited fortunes. Rather, they were self-made industrialists, aggressive entrepreneurs, and financial risk-takers who had ruthlessly seized the unprecedented economic opportunities of the era. They owned the towering grain elevators, the massive steel mills, the extensive railway lines, and the powerful commercial banks. Their prominent family names, such as Goodyear, Williams, Knox, Clement, Curtis, and Albright, became permanently synonymous with the city's golden age. They constructed magnificent architectural monuments along a grand residential boulevard, stretching northward from the heart of downtown, Delaware Avenue. This was Millionaire's Row, featuring 2.25 miles of elm-lined grandeur, where mansion after mansion rose in architectural styles drawn from the great aristocratic traditions of Europe. The city's newly wealthy summoned the finest, most celebrated architects in the nation to design their private palatial homes. Stanford White, the most famous architect of the Gilded Age, designed the neoclassical masterpiece known as the Williams Pratt Mansion. Completed in 1896, the prolific architectural firm of Green and Wicks designed dozens of grand residences in styles ranging from Beaux-Arts classical to ornate Tudor revival. The Clement Mansion, completed in 1914 for Stephen and Carolyn Clement at a staggering cost of $300,000, equivalent to tens of millions. In modern currency, featured thick grey sandstone walls and a music room rising a full story and a half with an elegant pipe organ. The Williams Butler Mansion, constructed for prominent banker George Williams, encompassed 16,000 square feet of living space with an additional 8,000 square foot carriage house. Williams spared no imaginable expense. His brother Charles lived directly next door in the Williams Pratt Mansion. The immediate physical proximity of the two brothers' vast estates symbolized the tightly interconnected nature of Buffalo's ruling class. The Goodyear Mansion, designed by E.B. Green and completed in 1903 for lumber and railroad magnate Charles W. Goodyear, featured warm brick, trimmed with ornate wood paneling, stained glass windows, and a soaring spiral staircase with wrought iron balustrades, a dramatic centerpiece designed to announce the owner's vast wealth to all who entered. Goodyear had accumulated his vast fortune as founder of the Great Southern Lumber Company and the Buffalo and Susquehanna Railroad. Among his closest personal friends was former President Grover Cleveland, who had famously served as mayor of Buffalo before his rapid political rise to the White House. These mansions were deliberately designed for grand public display. They sat close to the wide street, their magnificent facades fully visible to every passerby. The ruling elite of Buffalo formed a tightly knit high society, intermarrying generation after generation until Delaware Avenue became a complex network of interconnected families. They attended Westminster Presbyterian Church at 724 Delaware Avenue and belonged to exclusive private clubs like the Buffalo Club and the Saturn Club. Their children played together in Olmsted's Delaware Park at the northern terminus of the avenue, and their private carriages formed processionals along the boulevard on crisp Sunday afternoons. This was far more than a wealthy neighborhood. It was a genuine American aristocracy. Yet, even in Buffalo's golden age, there were dark, persistent shadows that the brilliant electric lights could not entirely dispel. The city's staggering wealth was built upon the backs of industries that relied on brutal, dangerous human labor. In the dark grain elevators along the river, men's backs were routinely broken, scooping heavy wheat. In the roaring steel mills south of the city, temperatures reached infernal levels, and industrial accidents claimed human limbs and lives with horrifying regularity. The thousands of working-class immigrants who made Buffalo's industrial machine function daily lived in crowded, unpaved neighborhoods far removed from the architectural splendor of Delaware Avenue. Labor unrest simmered constantly beneath the surface, leading to frequent and intense strikes as workers demanded fair wages, reasonable hours, and safer working conditions. In 1899, the city's vital grain industry was completely paralyzed by a massive dock workers' strike that highlighted the deepening, dangerous chasm between capital and labor. And then came the Pan American Exposition of 1901, Buffalo's supreme moment upon the global stage. The massive exposition was originally conceived as a grand celebration of the Western Hemisphere's growing economic interconnection and technological progress, but in reality, it served as a towering monument to Buffalo itself, a 6-month public showcase of the city's immense industrial importance and its absolute command of the new electric age. The exposition grounds spanned 350 sprawling acres on the western edge of what is now Delaware Park. The grand exhibition halls, designed in an ornate Spanish Renaissance style, were painted in brilliant, vibrant colors and outlined with more than 2 million incandescent electric light bulbs powered directly by the roaring turbines of Niagara Falls. At night, the exposition grounds transformed into the breathtaking Rainbow City, its soaring buildings glowing with a brilliant spectrum of electric light never before witnessed on such a scale. Its iconic centerpiece, the 389-foot electric tower, blazed with blinding white light that was visible for miles across the dark waters of Lake Erie. This was modern industrial progress, made physically manifest, the promising 20th century, announcing its grand arrival in watts, volts, and horsepower. President William McKinley had previously postponed his planned visit to the Pan American Exposition due to the Spanish-American War. But by the crisp autumn of 1901, the conflict was long won, and his national popularity was at an all-time high. Having recently begun his second term, he presided over a peaceful and exceptionally prosperous nation. His grand visit to Buffalo on September 5, 1901, was designed to be a triumphant victory lap. More than 116,000 people crowded onto the fairgrounds to hear the president speak. McKinley, always a gifted and resonant orator, delivered a landmark address outlining his forward-looking vision for American leadership in a changing world, advocating for reciprocal international trade agreements and peaceful global cooperation. That evening, the exposition hosted a spectacular fireworks display that culminated in a blinding burst of pyrotechnics, spelling out the words, "Welcome, President McKinley, Chief of our nation and our empire, against the dark night sky." The following morning, September 6th, McKinley and his invalid wife, Ida, took an early excursion to view the roaring waters of Niagara Falls, before returning to Buffalo for what was expected to be a routine afternoon event, a public greeting inside the exposition's magnificent Temple of Music. McKinley genuinely loved these public receptions. He took immense pride in shaking hands with everyday citizens and possessed a famous knack for greeting dozens of people per minute with a warm smile and a brief word of encouragement. His personal secretary, George Cortelyou, sensing severe security risks in such an unpoliced crowd, had attempted on 2 separate occasions to remove the Temple of Music greeting from the president's official itinerary. Both times, McKinley had firmly overruled him, stating that he had no desire to hide from his own people. At 7 minutes past 4 o'clock, William McKinley reached out his hand to greet yet another citizen in the long receiving line. The man's right hand was wrapped neatly in what appeared to be a white cotton bandage. Concealed beneath that cloth was a .32 caliber Ivor Johnson revolver. The man was Leon Czolgosz, an unemployed 28-year-old former mill worker from Detroit. Born to Polish immigrants, Czolgosz had lost his job during the devastating economic panic of 1893, subsequently embracing extreme anarchist philosophy as both an explanation for his personal suffering and a target for his smouldering rage. He had attended a speech by the famous radical Emma Goldman in May 1901 and was deeply inspired by news that an Italian anarchist had successfully assassinated King Umberto I the previous year. Czolgosz had travelled to Buffalo with a cold, deliberate plan to strike a lethal blow for what he believed were the oppressed working people of America. 2 sharp cracks shattered the ambient murmur of conversation inside the Temple of Music. McKinley staggered backward into the arms of his horrified Secret Service guards, dark blood instantly spreading across his white vest. As bodyguards and soldiers violently tackled Czolgosz to the floorboards, barely saving the assassin from being beaten to death on the spot by the enraged crowd, McKinley, even in his immense physical agony, whispered, "Do not let them hurt him." Then, his thoughts turning immediately to his frail wife, he murmured softly, "My wife, be careful, Cortelyou. How you tell her. Oh, be careful." Within minutes of the shooting, the bleeding president was loaded into an electric ambulance, one of the modern technological marvels on display at the fairgrounds, and rushed to the exposition's small emergency hospital. The gunshot wounds were severe. One bullet had merely grazed McKinley's sternum, inflicting minor superficial damage. However, the second bullet had entered his upper abdomen, tearing straight through his stomach. What followed over the next several hours was a catastrophic chain of medical decisions that ultimately sealed the chief executive's fate. The only surgeon immediately available at the exposition grounds was Dr. Matthew Mann, a gynecological specialist with virtually no practical experience in treating abdominal gunshot trauma. With no time to wait for a more qualified military surgeon, McKinley was rushed directly onto the operating table. The operating room was dangerously dim, and the emergency surgery took place as the late afternoon sun rapidly faded. An electric light was rigged to illuminate the surgical field, but it proved woefully inadequate. Someone suggested using a large pan-reflector mirror to bounce natural sunlight into the open wound, but by then, the sun had already set. Dr. Mann opened the president's abdomen and located 2 perforations where the bullet had entered and exited the stomach. He sutured these tears with great care, but he was completely unable to locate the bullet itself, which had lodged deep within the heavy muscles of the president's back. After a brief debate among the attending physicians, Mann decided to leave the bullet where it sat, reasoning that probing blindly through internal organs would cause far more trauma. He flushed the abdominal cavity and prepared to close the surgical incision. This is the precise moment when the emergency operation descended into the realm of the surreal. With no sterile surgical silk sutures readily available in the small clinic, Dr. Mann closed the abdominal wall of the President of the United States using ordinary black silk thread and a straight sewing needle, the exact materials used for mending clothes. News of the shooting flashed across the nation at the speed of the telegraph. In Vermont, where Vice President Theodore Roosevelt was speaking at a state fish and game event, a messenger delivered the shocking news. Roosevelt immediately departed for Buffalo, arriving by a frantic combination of rowboat, private yacht, and express train. Taking up quarters at the Ansley Wilcox mansion on Delaware Avenue, Roosevelt waited anxiously for daily updates on McKinley's condition. For several days, those medical updates were remarkably encouraging. McKinley appeared to be making a miraculous recovery. His vital signs stabilized, his fever dropped, and he was alert and taking small amounts of liquid nourishment. The attending physicians issued glowing, optimistic public bulletins, and a nation that had held its collective breath began to exhale. Roosevelt, fully convinced that the crisis had passed, left Buffalo on September 10th to join his vacationing family in the high Adirondack Mountains. Back in Buffalo, the famed inventor Thomas Edison, hearing of the shooting, dispatched an early X-ray machine to the city, a cutting-edge piece of medical technology capable of pinpointing the exact location of the bullet lodged in McKinley's body. The machine arrived at the residence, was set up by technicians, and was then completely rejected by the medical team. The doctors, overly confident in their initial surgical work, saw no need to subject the president to an experimental device. It was a fateful blunder that would haunt American medical history for generations. On September 12th, as Theodore Roosevelt was hiking up Mount Marcy in the remote Adirondacks, William McKinley took a sudden, catastrophic turn for the worse. Severe gangrene had set in around the internal bullet wounds, a direct consequence of the hasty surgery. Unsterilized thread, unextracted bullet fragments, and decaying tissue. McKinley's fever spiked uncontrollably, his pulse raced, and toxic sepsis flooded his bloodstream. An urgent telegram was dispatched to the mountains. The vice president must return to Buffalo immediately. Roosevelt received the message late at night at a remote mountain lodge. Without waiting for daylight, he departed at midnight, traveling by horse-drawn wagon over treacherous, pitch-black mountain roads to reach the nearest railway station, 35 miles away. When Roosevelt finally reached the North Creek train depot, just before dawn on September 14th, he received the devastating news. President William McKinley had passed away several hours earlier, at 2:15 that morning. McKinley's final whispered words had been the lines of his favorite hymn, "Nearer, my God, to thee." Roosevelt boarded a fast express train bound for Albany, then another straight to Buffalo, arriving at the central passenger station at 1:30 in the afternoon. Ansley Wilcox, the prominent Buffalo lawyer whose grand mansion on Delaware Avenue had served as Roosevelt's residence during the previous week's vigil, met the vice president at the platform. The entire city was in emotional turmoil and military lockdown. Armed cavalry troopers escorted Roosevelt's carriage through crowded, silent streets lined with grieving citizens. The immediate pressing question, facing government officials, was where Roosevelt should take the solemn presidential oath of office. The initial suggestion was to hold the official ceremony at the Milburn House on Delaware Avenue, where McKinley had been staying and where his body now lay in state. But this was quickly deemed deeply inappropriate. How could a public celebration of new political power occur inside a house of profound mourning? It was swiftly decided that the oath would be administered in the library of the Annesley Wilcox mansion. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, approximately 50 people had quietly gathered in the formal library of the Wilcox house. Members of McKinley's cabinet, federal judges, local civic dignitaries, and members of Roosevelt's extended family. Roosevelt had changed out of his mud-splattered traveling clothes into a borrowed black frock coat and dark trousers. He had first visited the Milburn house to pay his deep respects to McKinley's widow, Ida, who was prostrate with grief. Now, he stood solemnly in the Wilcox library before a wide bay window, his right hand raised, his voice wavering slightly at first, before growing firm and resolute. United States District Judge John R. Hazel administered the oath. Roosevelt repeated the heavy words, "I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States, and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States." He added at the end, "And thus I swear." At 3:32 in the afternoon, on September 14, 1901, Theodore Roosevelt officially became the 26th President of the United States. He was just 42 years old, the youngest man ever to assume the presidency. For 13 full hours, from the exact moment of McKinley's death at 2:15 in the morning until Roosevelt took the oath at 3:32 in the afternoon, the highest executive office in the United States had technically been vacant. This constitutional anomaly would not be formalized until the ratification of the 25th Amendment in 1967, but in 1901, it created a bizarre, haunting historical moment, a sovereign republic without a living leader, if only for half a day. As for Leon Czolgosz, swift and uncompromising justice was meted out. He was brought to trial just 9 days after McKinley's death, in a proceeding that lasted a mere 3 days. Czolgosz offered no legal defense, telling the court he had simply done his duty in killing an enemy of the working people. On October 29, 1901, less than 8 weeks after pulling the trigger, Czolgosz was executed in the electric chair at Auburn Prison. His last words were, "I killed the president for the good of the laboring people, the good people. I am not sorry for my crime." Buffalo had achieved something it had long sought, a permanent place in the nation's historical consciousness, as far more than a regional hub of industrial commerce. But the price paid for that notoriety was unimaginably high. The Pan American Exposition, intended to showcase Buffalo's grand debut as a world-class metropolis, would forever be remembered primarily as the site of a tragic presidential assassination. The brilliant light of the Rainbow City was extinguished forever in November 1901, when the exposition closed its gates and its magnificent plaster palaces were torn down. Yet, in 1901, Buffalo's ruling elite could not possibly imagine that their city's finest days were already behind them. The stone mansions of Delaware Avenue still stood in their absolute glory. The massive mills and factories along the lakeshore still ran at full capacity. The grain elevators processed tens of millions of bushels of wheat, and heavy steam trains came and went with mathematical precision. Buffalo remained the 8th largest city in America, a sprawling metropolis of immense wealth, industrial power, and boundless ambition. How could anyone predict that within a single generation, the very forces that had lifted Buffalo to such dizzying heights would abandon it to a long, excruciating decline? 36 years earlier, in April 1865, another fallen president had passed through the city under dark circumstances. Abraham Lincoln's body, carried on a slow funeral train across the northern states, had arrived at Buffalo's Exchange Street station on the morning of April 27, 1865. The president's casket was transferred to a grand hearse, drawn by 6 white horses, draped in black velvet, and brought directly to St. James Hall on Main Street. There, Lincoln's body lay in state, as between 80,000 and 100,000 people filed past his coffin, an astonishing number that represented nearly the entire population of Buffalo at the time. There is a deep, poetic symmetry to Buffalo's presidential moments. Lincoln lying in state in 1865, and Roosevelt taking the oath in 1901. Both historic moments spoke to Buffalo's vital importance in the national narrative. But there is also a dark, tragic undercurrent to the fact that both moments centered around violent death, the sudden termination of a presidency by an assassin's bullet. The decades immediately following the McKinley assassination saw Buffalo continue its massive industrial expansion, but subtle cracks were already forming in its foundation. The great technological advantage that had made Buffalo wealthy, its position as an indispensable physical link in the transportation chain between the Great Lakes and the Atlantic, was slowly becoming less critical. The rise of motor trucks and paved highways began freeing commerce from total dependence on inland waterways and railroad hubs. The unique geographic advantages that Buffalo had enjoyed for nearly a century were being systematically eroded by technological progress. The real blow to Buffalo's industrial supremacy came in the mid-20th century. After World War II, the city's heavy industries had roared back to life with incredible force. The national war effort required immense volumes of steel, aircraft components, trucks, and military ammunition, and Buffalo's factories worked around the clock to produce them. The city's population reached its absolute historic peak in 1950, cresting at 580,132 residents, making it the 15th largest city in the United States. Millionaire's Row, though many of its grand mansions had already been subdivided or converted to institutional uses, still retained much of its architectural dignity. There was still ample reason for civic optimism across the region. Then came the opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway in 1957. For more than a century, large cargo freighters traveling between the western Great Lakes and the Atlantic Ocean had been physically forced to stop in Buffalo to unload their grain, ore, and manufactured goods for transshipment along rail lines or canals. The opening of the deep-water St. Lawrence Seaway instantly eliminated that geographic necessity. Ocean-going cargo ships could now sail directly from Duluth or Chicago straight to the Atlantic without ever stopping in Buffalo. Overnight, one of the city's primary economic functions vanished. The soaring grain elevators, those massive cathedrals of commerce that had defined Buffalo's waterfront skyline, began to fall silent one by one. The volume of commercial shipping moving through Buffalo's port plummeted catastrophically. The economic decline was not sudden, but it was utterly inexorable. Buffalo's resident population began dropping steadily in the 1950s and accelerated violently during the 1970s, the worst decade in the city's history, when the municipality lost over 100,000 residents alongside the vast majority of its middle class. By 2010, Buffalo's population had fallen to approximately 260,000, a staggering loss of more than 55% from its mid-century peak. The root causes were multiple and deeply interconnected. The opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway, the rapid collapse of the American steel industry in the face of intense foreign competition, the permanent closure of heavy manufacturing plants, middle-class white flight to the surrounding suburbs, and the severe physical decay of the urban core. The American Rust Belt earned its tragic name, and Buffalo rusted alongside its regional neighbors. The raw demographic statistics tell only a small part of the story. Behind those cold numbers lay human lives disrupted, families uprooted, and tightly knit communities destroyed. When the massive steel mills closed, it was not merely jobs that were lost, but an entire way of life passed down through generations. Men who had worked in the fiery mills for decades, who fully expected to retire from the exact same company where their fathers had worked, found themselves permanently unemployed in their 50s, too old to retrain for a new career and too young to collect retirement benefits. The working-class neighborhoods surrounding the heavy steel plants, such as South Buffalo and Lackawanna, had been constructed specifically to house mill workers. When those workers were laid off, entire residential blocks emptied out. Homes that had once been filled with large, multi-generational families fell completely silent. Neighborhood grocery stores closed their doors for lack of customers. Local churches lost their congregations, and neighborhood elementary schools shuttered permanently. In 1982, Bethlehem Steel officially announced the permanent closure of its massive Lackawanna steel plant, laying off its remaining 10,000 workers in crushing waves. An additional 8,000 workers in surrounding towns lost their jobs as a direct result. The vast industrial complex that had once employed tens of thousands stood hollow and abandoned, a silent monument to a vanished era. When the final work shift ended on October 15, 1982, grown men wept openly as they walked out through the factory gates for the last time. Other heavy factories quickly followed, shuttered, demolished, or left to rot in the harsh winter weather. The towering grain elevators along the waterfront fell completely silent, their iron machinery rusting in place. Ships stopped coming to Buffalo's port in the numbers they once had. The waterfront, once a bustling hive of economic activity, transformed into a barren wasteland of abandoned industrial buildings and crumbling concrete piers. The manufacturing jobs vanished, and with them went the city's tax base, public services, and essential investments in municipal infrastructure and public education. Entire residential neighborhoods emptied out. On the city's east side, which had once been home to vibrant, bustling Polish and Italian working-class communities, block after block of houses were abandoned and eventually demolished by the city, leaving vast empty lots overgrown with wild weeds. The grand commercial buildings downtown, constructed during Buffalo's Gilded Age boom, lost their commercial tenants and became silent repositories for roosting pigeons and fading memories. The median family income in Buffalo plummeted, while poverty rates soared to more than double the national average. The mansions of Delaware Avenue met various heartbreaking fates, most of them deeply tragic. Some were demolished outright by property developers, their historic sites replaced by asphalt parking lots or sterile modern commercial buildings that bore no relation whatsoever to the architectural grandeur they had displaced. Others were subdivided into cheap apartments, their grand reception rooms partitioned by wood paneling and their hand-carved details destroyed. A few were acquired by non-profit organizations or local charities struggling to maintain their costly upkeep. The Clement Mansion, once a glittering gathering place for Buffalo's industrial elite, was donated to the American Red Cross. The Goodyear Mansion eventually became a private school before being subdivided into apartments. Many mansions changed hands repeatedly, with each successive owner less capable of maintaining the massive structures than the last. Their opulent interiors, once filled with fine European art and imported furniture, were emptied at liquidating estate sales. Their manicured gardens, once pristine, grew wild or were paved over for parking spaces. In 1974, what remained of the avenue's historic architecture was added to the National Register of Historic Places as the Delaware Avenue Historic District, an official acknowledgement of its profound historical significance, but also a stark admission that these irreplaceable treasures were under severe threat. By then, the district was a mere shadow of what Millionaire's Row had once been. The stately American elm trees that had formed a soaring green canopy over the avenue were entirely wiped out by Dutch elm disease. The quiet, dignified atmosphere was replaced by the roar of heavy commuter traffic. Where luxury carriages had once deposited wealthy guests for grand social galas, cars now rushed past, their drivers barely sparing a glance at the fading facades. The Ansley Wilcox House, where Theodore Roosevelt had taken the solemn presidential oath of office, faced its own perilous period of decline. After the Wilcox family departed in the 1930s, the mansion was converted into a commercial restaurant. During that incarnation, much of its historic interior was gutted. The grand main staircase was removed, and structural walls were torn down to create open dining areas. By the 1960s, the building was under imminent threat of demolition. Only a desperate, coordinated preservation effort saved it. In 1966, Congress authorized its acquisition as a National Historic Site, and in 1969 it was transferred to the National Park Service. Slowly and painstakingly, the house was restored to its 1901 appearance, its library reconstructed to match the exact scene of Roosevelt's inauguration. The question that forever haunts Buffalo is the same question that haunts all declining industrial centers across the American Rust Belt. Could it have been different? Could Buffalo have successfully adapted to a shifting global economy, retained its population, and preserved its architectural heritage? Or was the city's collapse entirely inevitable, once the specific geographic and technological advantages that created its wealth became obsolete? There are no simple answers to these lingering questions. Certain industrial cities, like Pittsburgh, managed to reinvent themselves after the collapse of steel, transitioning toward technology, medicine, and higher education. Buffalo has made heroic efforts in these directions, with the State University of New York at Buffalo and its expanding medical campus becoming major regional employers. Recent decades have seen modest revitalization along Canal Side, and the preservation of irreplaceable architectural treasures like Frank Lloyd Wright's Darwin D. Martin House and the Richardson Olmsted campus. The population even stabilized in the 2020 census, marking its first modest increase in 70 years. Yet, those modest modern gains are small compared to the vast industrial empire that was lost. Buffalo will likely never recover its Gilded Age prominence, but what remains is a profound physical testament to American ambition. The massive stone mansions that still stand along Delaware Avenue, the silent grain elevators towering over the waterfront, and the restored library inside the Wilcox Mansion all speak of a time when Buffalo believed its future was completely unlimited. They stand today as monuments to vanished confidence, reminding us that brick and mortar can outlast the economic empires that built them. Inside the library of the Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural National Historic Site, a small plaque marks the exact spot where a young vice president raised his hand and assumed the presidency under the darkest of circumstances. That moment lasted only seconds, but it pinpoints an hour when Buffalo was the absolute center of the American universe, a city that touched the sun before slipping softly into the shadows of history. It is time now to let the dramatic, sweeping history of this forgotten capital rest. Step away from the ghosts of Delaware Avenue, leave behind the echoing silence of the mills, and allow the quiet ledger of time to close softly. May you have a deep, peaceful, and truly restorative sleep tonight. When the morning sun rises once again over your horizon, may you be filled with clarity, inspiration, and fresh creative energy for your journey ahead. Good night, storyteller of the evening.